Welcome back, listeners. Today we're taking a deep dive into the world of psychoanalysis, but we're going beyond Freud this
Oh,
time.
yeah.
We're exploring those key Neo-Freudian thinkers, the
Yeah.
ones who kind of took his ideas and spun them in some fascinating new direction.
Yeah.
We're using Chapter 11 of the Personality Puzzle, the 8th
Okay.
edition. So
Totally.
if you've got your copy, feel free to follow along,
Mm-hmm.
ready to see how these thinkers reshaped our understanding of the mind.
Absolutely. It's really fascinating how these Neo-Freudians took Freud's groundwork and, didn't just accept it blindly, but really questioned some of his core assumptions.
Yeah.
And it ended up expanding psychoanalysis in some whole new directions.
Yeah, the book highlights three big themes that seem to connect most of these thinkers.
Right.
First up, libido. Now, Freud, he was all about that sexual energy.
Yeah, libido was everything for him.
But the Neo-Freudians, they weren't so convinced.
Right. They reinterpreted libido as a more general life force, not just about sex. Think of it more as the energy that fuels all of our drives and desires.
Right.
Everything from creativity and achievement to, the need for connection and meaning. So it's a more holistic view of what makes us tick.
So it's not just about, getting our groove on. There's more to motivation than just that primal urge.
Exactly. It really broadens the scope of what drives us and recognizes the complexity of human motivation.
Okay, that makes sense. Now, the second common thread is a move away from viewing the unconscious as like the be-all and end-all.
Right. So Freud was really fixated on the depths of the unconscious, right? Like that's where everything was happening.
Right, right.
But the Neo-Freudians kind of brought the ego into the spotlight a little bit more.
Mm-hmm.
They emphasized things like conscious thought processes, perception, and reasoning, like how we make sense of the world around us.
So they were kind of bridging the gap between, like, Freud's ideas and what we now know about things like cognitive psychology.
Absolutely. This shift really acknowledges that we're not just puppets of our unconscious desires.
Yeah.
We actually have the capacity to think critically, to make choices, and to shape our own destinies.
Okay, so less we're all slaves to our id, and more we have agency.
Exactly.
Interesting. And then lastly, the Neo-Freudians really zeroed in on relationships.
Yeah, they recognize the profound impact of interpersonal relationships on shaping our personality and well-being, especially those early attachments, like the bond between a child and their parents. Those early experiences can really have a ripple effect throughout our lives.
It's like that saying, like, our childhood wounds become our adult baggage.
Exactly. Those early relationships really form the template for how we interact with others, how we perceive ourselves, and even how we cope with challenges.
Okay, so we've set the stage. We've kind of got this broad overview.
Right.
Now let's dive into the work of some of these individual Neo-Freudians.
Okay.
And first up, Alfred Adler.
Okay.
Now, he broke away from Freud pretty dramatically.
He did. Yeah, there were some fundamental disagreements there.
What was his main point of disagreement?
Well, Adler believed that Freud put way too much emphasis on sex as the primary motivator. He argued that it's really our striving for superiority that drives personality,
Okay.
which stems from those early feelings of inferiority, right?
Yeah.
So it's about overcoming those feelings.
I remember reading about his concept of, like, organ inferiority. Can you refresh my memory on that one?
Yeah, imagine a child who feels, let's say, physically weak or uncoordinated growing up.
Right.
Adler suggested that they might overcompensate for that by, becoming a star athlete or a bodybuilder as an adult. It's about overcoming those perceived weaknesses.
Okay.
Not necessarily actual limitations, but just where we feel inadequate.
So it's not just about physical limitations. It could be any area where we feel, inadequate or less than.
Exactly. It's about that inherent drive to prove ourselves, to overcome obstacles, and to achieve a sense of mastery in those areas where we felt lacking.
And that ties into his concept of masculine protest, right?
Yes.
So I remember the book mentioning, like, a guy driving a giant truck as an example.
Yes. Think of it as overcompensating for feeling powerless or inadequate as a child,
Right.
That need to assert dominance, to kind of prove one's masculinity, often in these exaggerated ways.
So it's not just about men literally protesting.
Right.
It's this broader idea about how we try to compensate for those early feelings of inferiority.
Exactly. And you can see it in all sorts of things. The drive for power, the need for recognition, the relentless pursuit of success. All of these are ways we try to prove our worth and overcome those early feelings of being less than.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. It's like we're all on this quest for validation, for significance.
Right.
And it's driven by these early experiences where we felt, small or powerless.
Right. And understanding that drive can be incredibly insightful, It helps us make sense of our own motivations and the behaviors of others.
Let's move on to another big name, Carl Jung. Now, his ideas get a bit more mystical, wouldn't you say?
Jung's work definitely delves into the more symbolic and spiritual aspects of the psyche, that's for sure.
Yeah, I was always intrigued by his concept of the collective unconscious. Tell me more about that.
Okay, so Jung believed that beneath our personal unconscious, there's this even deeper layer, a collective unconscious that's shared by all humanity.
Okay.
And he saw it as this reservoir of universal archetypes, these primordial images and symbols that we all inherit.
So these archetypes are like those universal characters we see in myths and stories across cultures, like the hero, the villain, the wise old man.
Exactly. Jung believed that these figures represent universal patterns in the human psyche, like blueprints for our experiences, for our relationships, even for our personalities.
And what about the persona? Now that's the mask we wear in public.
Right. Precisely. It's the social face we present to the world. And, we often conceal parts of our true selves to fit in, to be accepted, or to achieve certain goals.
It's like that saying, all the world's a stage, and all the men and women merely players.
Right.
We're all playing these roles to some extent.
To some extent, yes.
Yeah.
But Jung also warned against becoming too identified with our persona. He believed that it's essential to connect with our authentic selves, the selves beneath the mask.
Right.
To embrace even our shadow side, to become whole.
That makes me think of his ideas about the anima and animus.
Yes.
Can you explain those?
So the anima represents the feminine archetype within men, while the animus is the masculine archetype within women.
Okay.
And Jung believed that these archetypes really influence how we relate to the opposite sex. Often we're projecting our idealized images onto our partners.
It's like we're all carrying around these internal blueprints for man and woman, and we're trying to, fit our partners into those molds.
Right. And, that can lead to all sorts of misunderstandings and conflicts in relationships.
Okay, that fascinates. And then, of course, there's Jung's famous introvert-extrovert distinction.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, everyone knows about that, even if they don't know Jung.
Right. That's definitely one of his most enduring contributions to psychology.
Right.
And he also proposed 4 basic types of thinking: rational, feeling, sensing, and intuiting. And while, the popular Myers-Briggs test kind of draws inspiration from this,
right,
it doesn't have the same kind of scientific rigor as, modern personality assessments.
So Jung's work, with all this talk of the unconscious and archetypes and the shadow self, it really expanded the scope of psychoanalysis.
Absolutely. His ideas continue to resonate, especially in areas like art, literature, spirituality, where the exploration of symbols and archetypes is still very relevant.
Now, let's move on to a pioneering woman in psychoanalysis, Karen Horney.
Yes.
Now, she wasn't afraid to challenge some of Freud's more, shall we say, controversial ideas.
No, she wasn't. She was a force to be reckoned with.
Yeah.
And she took direct aim at Freud's concept of penis envy.
Oh, yeah.
Arguing that if women envied men, it wasn't actually about anatomical differences, but more about the limitations and power imbalances that society imposed on them.
That was a bold statement, especially for that time. I can only imagine the pushback she faced.
She was a true trailblazer.
Yeah.
And Horney emphasized the impact of social structures on women's psychology, a perspective that's, still really informs feminist thought today.
Horney also developed her own unique concepts like basic anxiety. What exactly is that?
So she described basic anxiety as this kind of fundamental feeling of helplessness and insecurity that arises from early childhood experiences, particularly within the family.
So it's not just general anxiety that we all experience from time to time.
Right. It's deeper than that.
It's a deeper, more pervasive sense of unease rooted in those early relationships.
Exactly. It's that feeling of being alone and vulnerable in a world that can often feel hostile or indifferent.
And she argued that we develop these neurotic needs to cope with that basic anxiety.
Right. These are essentially exaggerated or unrealistic needs that we develop to try to gain a sense of control, security, or validation. Like a desperate need for approval, the need to control others, or the need for complete self-sufficiency.
I can see how those needs might offer a temporary sense of relief from that anxiety, but
Yeah,
ultimately lead to some unhealthy patterns.
exactly. Horney believed that these neurotic needs could lead to all sorts of problems: interpersonal conflicts, self-sabotaging behaviors, even a distorted view of oneself and the world.
So Horney's work, with its emphasis on those societal influences, basic anxiety, neurotic needs,
Yeah,
it really shifted the focus of psychoanalysis, didn't it?
absolutely. It really paved the way for a more nuanced understanding of how things like culture, gender roles, and early family dynamics shape our personalities and, our struggles.
Okay, before we move on, can you tell me a little bit about Erik Erikson?
Of course. So unlike Freud, who believed that personality development stopped at puberty,
Right.
Erikson argued that development continues throughout our entire lives.
Okay.
And he shifted the focus from those psychosexual stages to psychosocial ones, really emphasizing the social and cultural influences on our growth.
So instead of being fixated on those, erogenous zones,
Yeah.
Erikson focused on those crucial social and emotional challenges we face at each stage of life.
Exactly. And he proposed 8 stages, from infancy all the way to old age, each
Wow.
with its own unique conflict that needs to be resolved for healthy development.
I know we can't dive into all 8 stages right now, but can you just give me a quick overview of a couple that are particularly relevant to, let's say, young adults?
Okay, so in young adulthood, the primary conflict is intimacy versus isolation.
Mm.
This is the stage where we're figuring out how to form close, meaningful relationships,
Right.
but without losing our sense of self.
It's like that balancing act between needing connection and wanting independence.
Exactly. And if we don't successfully navigate this stage, we can end up feeling isolated, lonely, or unable to form lasting bonds.
And what about the next stage? What happens after we've hopefully mastered intimacy?
Well, then it's on to generativity versus stagnation,
Okay.
which typically occurs during middle adulthood. And this is where we really focus on contributing to society, raising families, mentoring others, creating something that will outlast us.
So it's about finding meaning and purpose beyond our own individual needs and desires.
Exactly. It's about making a difference in the world, leaving a legacy, feeling a sense of accomplishment and connection to something larger than ourselves.
I can see how that stage would bring up a lot of big questions
Yeah,
about our values, our purpose, and how we want to spend our time and energy.
absolutely. It's a time of reflection, reevaluation, and often a renewed sense of purpose.
This is fascinating stuff. I'm already starting to see how these ideas apply to my own life and relationships.
That's the power of psychoanalysis, right?
Yeah.
It offers a framework for understanding ourselves and others in a deeper, more insightful way.
Now, I know there's one more big area we need to cover,
Yeah.
and that's object relations theory.
Yes.
This one sounds particularly juicy, especially for someone like me who's always been fascinated by the complexities of relationships.
Yeah, object relations theory really dives into the nitty-gritty of how our early experiences, particularly with our primary caregivers, shape the way we relate to others throughout our lives.
So it's like those early relationships create a blueprint for how we see ourselves, how we see others, and how we navigate this messy world of love, attachment, and intimacy.
Exactly.
Okay, I'm ready to unpack this.
Yeah.
But before we do, we need to take a quick break. We'll be right back after this.
All right. So object relations theory,
Mm.
one of the key ideas here is that we relate to others through these mental images, right? These
Yeah.
internal representations of people, and we call these objects.
Just objects, like not a literal like lamp or chair, but more like an internalized picture of mom or dad.
Exactly. And these images, they aren't always accurate reflections of the actual person.
Right.
They're colored by our experiences, our needs, and often our unconscious desires.
That makes sense. I mean, haven't we all had those moments where we like put someone on a pedestal,
Yeah.
only to realize later that we were totally projecting our own fantasies onto them?
Oh, absolutely. That's a classic example of how these internal objects can really distort our perceptions and, lead us down some interesting relationship paths.
Okay, so the book highlights 4 key themes in object relations theory.
Right.
Can you walk me through those?
Of course. So the first one is that, every relationship, no matter how loving or intense it is, has elements of both satisfaction and frustration. It's that inevitable mix of pleasure and pain that comes with being connected to another human being.
I mean, that's just the reality of relationships, isn't it? Nobody's perfect, and even the best relationships have their ups and downs.
Right. And Melanie Klein, who is a real pioneer in object relations theory, she pointed to the infant's relationship with the mother's breast
Okay.
as a prime example of this. The breast provides nourishment and comfort, but it can also be a source of frustration when it's unavailable or it doesn't meet the infant's needs.
It's interesting how she used something so, basic and primal to illustrate that inherent duality in relationship.
Right. It really highlights how even from the very beginning, our relationships are marked by this interplay of love and frustration, dependence and independence.
Okay, so what's the second theme?
The second theme kind of builds on that idea. It's the recognition that we often feel both love and hate towards the same person.
Oh, I definitely relate to that.
Yeah.
Especially when it comes to family.
Yeah.
It's like that saying, you can choose your friends, but you can't choose your family.
Yeah.
Sometimes the people we love the most are also the ones who drive us the craziest.
Exactly. Object relations theory really acknowledges that complexity. It suggests that love and hate aren't mutually exclusive. They can coexist. Sometimes they even intertwine in ways that, create those intense emotional knots that we often feel in relationships.
So it's not just about repressing those negative feelings or pretending they don't exist.
Yeah.
It's about recognizing that they're part of the package.
Precisely. And that can be a tough pill to swallow, especially, when we're raised on fairy tales and rom-coms that paint this really idealized picture of love.
Okay, theme number 3.
All right, so this one focuses on the challenge of seeing the whole person, right? Not just the parts we find attractive or desirable. It's about moving beyond those projections and idealized images and really recognizing the other person as a complete individual with all their flaws and complexities.
It's like when you first start dating someone and they seem perfect, But then you start to see their quirks and imperfections. And sometimes those are the very things that end up driving you crazy.
Right. But the goal, according to object relations theory, is to learn to love the whole person.
Okay.
Not just the parts that fit our idealized image.
That sounds like a tall order, especially in today's world where we're constantly bombarded with these images of perfection and instant gratification.
It is a challenge, but it's also the path to, deeper, more authentic connections.
And the fourth theme.
This one highlights the psychological struggle that arises from these mixed feelings, It's the awareness, on some level, that we have these contradictory emotions towards someone we care about. The love and the hate, the idealization and the disappointment. And that can create a lot of internal conflict.
So it's like we're constantly grappling with those internal objects, trying to make sense of those conflicting feelings and reconcile them with reality.
Exactly. And that's where, defense mechanisms come into play. We might use denial, projection, or even idealization to protect ourselves from those painful or confusing emotions.
So in a way, object relations theory is saying that our relationships are like these miniature psychodramas playing out on the stage of our minds.
That's a great way to put it.
Okay, so the book specifically mentions 2 key figures in object relations theory, Melanie Klein and D.W. Winnicott.
Yes.
Let's talk about them. What did they bring to the table?
Okay, so Klein is known for her work with children,
Okay.
particularly her use of play therapy. She also developed this concept of splitting, which is the tendency to divide our objects into good and bad.
So it's like that classic cartoon image of the angel on one shoulder and the devil on the other.
Exactly.
We're constantly wrestling with these opposing forces within ourselves and within our relationships.
Right. Klein believed that splitting is a defense mechanism, a way of managing the anxiety that comes with holding both positive and negative feelings towards the same person.
It's like we're trying to simplify those complex emotions by compartmentalizing them, but ultimately it just creates more internal conflict.
Right. It's about integrating those different aspects, the good and the bad, into a more holistic understanding of ourselves and others.
Okay, and what about Winnicott? What were his big ideas?
So Winnicott is probably most famous for his concept of the transitional object. This is that special blanket stuffed animal or even a piece of cloth that a child becomes really attached to.
Yes. The quintessential security blanket.
Yes.
My niece has this raggedy old teddy bear she takes everywhere with her.
Yeah.
It's practically falling apart, but she won't let it out of her sight.
That's a perfect example.
Yeah.
Winnicott believed that these objects help children bridge the gap between dependence on their caregivers and the development of independence.
So it's like a symbolic representation of that early attachment, providing comfort and security in the absence of the primary caregiver.
Exactly. And he believed that these transitional objects serve a really important psychological function,
Right.
helping children manage anxiety, soothe themselves, and even develop a sense of autonomy.
And he didn't think this was just limited to childhood, right?
Right. He suggested that adults also have their own versions of transitional objects.
Okay.
Things that provide comfort and a sense of continuity in the face of stress or change.
So like that old sweater you just can't throw away. or those cherished family photos we keep on our desks.
Exactly. They serve as these tangible representations of our emotional connections, and they offer us this sense of security and grounding in a world that can often feel unpredictable.
Now, I remember Winnicott also introduced the concept of the false self.
Yes.
That sounds a bit like Jung's persona,
Yeah.
right? Are they the same thing?
They are similar in that they both involve, presenting a certain face to the world, often to protect our true selves from hurt or rejection. But Winnicott went a little bit deeper. He suggested that the false self can become so dominant that it actually eclipses our authentic selves.
So it's like we're so busy playing the role that we lose touch with who we really are. We become disconnected from our true feelings and desires.
Right, and that can lead to a lot of internal conflict, a sense of emptiness, or even, a feeling of alienation from oneself.
That's a bit sobering. It makes you wonder how much of our lives are spent performing for others, and how much of it is truly authentic.
It's a question worth pondering.
Okay, before we move on, is there anything else I should know about object relations theory?
Well, just to emphasize, this approach to psychoanalysis is still very much alive and relevant today. It's an active area of research.
Oh, wow.
And it really informs a lot of clinical work, especially in the realm of relationship therapy.
So it's not just some dusty old theory from the past. It's actually helping people understand and navigate their relationships in the present.
Absolutely. It's a testament to the enduring legacy of psychoanalysis and its ability to evolve and adapt to, contemporary challenges.
Okay, that's good to know.
Yeah.
Now, I'm curious about the current research on psychoanalysis. I mean, how do we know if these theories actually hold up under scientific scrutiny? Are there ways to actually test these ideas, in a lab setting?
That's a great question. You're right, there's been a bit of a historical divide between academic research and clinical psychoanalysis.
Yeah.
Psychoanalysis is often seen as this, fuzzy subjective realm, difficult to measure or test in a traditional scientific setting.
Right, because it deals with so much of what's happening beneath the surface.
Yeah. Exactly. But there have been some really pioneering researchers who've bridged that gap.
Yeah.
Finding ways to test psychoanalytic concepts using rigorous scientific methods.
So they're like the Indiana Joneses of psychology, venturing into uncharted territory and bringing back empirical evidence.
I love that analogy.
So Drew Weston is one of the key figures in this area, right?
He is.
Yeah.
Yeah, Weston's argued that a lot of the research that's being conducted in psychology is actually relevant to psychoanalysis,
Interesting.
even if the researchers themselves aren't even aware of it.
So it's like they're unwittingly testing Freudian ideas without even realizing it.
Exactly. It's pretty fascinating.
So what are some examples of this research? What kind of studies are they doing?
Well, one area that's provided some really compelling evidence is the study of perceptual defense. You know how Freud described the ego's role in protecting us from threatening or anxiety-provoking stimuli?
Right. It's like our internal bodyguard,
Yes.
shielding us from things that might, overwhelm or upset us.
Yeah, exactly. And there have been some fascinating experiments using a tachistoscope.
What?
A tachistoscope. It's a device that flashes words or images very quickly,
Okay.
almost subliminally.
So like a psychological magic trick.
Kind of, yeah.
Yeah.
They're sneaking these words into your subconscious.
Interesting.
And what they found is that people were slower to recognize emotionally charged or threatening words, even though their physiological responses indicated that they had registered the stimuli unconsciously.
So it's like their minds were trying to block out those words even before they were consciously aware of them.
Exactly.
It's incredible.
It really supports the idea that we have these unconscious defense mechanisms at play, filtering information and protecting us from psychological distress.
That's pretty mind-blowing. And this research aligns with what we now know about, cognitive psychology and unconscious thought processes, right?
Absolutely. We now know that the vast majority of our mental activity happens below the level of conscious awareness.
So Freud's iceberg metaphor is looking pretty accurate these days.
Indeed. And studies have also provided support for other psychoanalytic concepts like, defense mechanisms, personality types, and even the therapeutic benefits of catharsis.
Catharsis being that emotional release we experience when we finally, express or confront those pent-up feelings.
Exactly. Research suggests that talking about our problems, processing difficult emotions, and finding healthy outlets for expression can be incredibly beneficial for our mental and even physical health.
So there's scientific validation for those therapy sessions and journaling sprees.
There you go. And, while not all of Freud's ideas have held up under scientific scrutiny,
Right.
for example, the Oedipal complex.
Okay, maybe Freud got a few things wrong.
Yeah, a few things. But the overall impact of his work and the contributions of the Neo-Freudians are undeniable.
Okay.
They revolutionized how we think about the human mind, and they continue to offer valuable insights into personality, motivation, and relationships.
So what's the takeaway for me? What does all this mean for understanding myself and others?
Well, I think the key is to remember that psychoanalysis, even with its flaws and controversies, offers a really rich and nuanced perspective on human nature. It's a deep dive into the hidden depths of our motivations, our desires, our fears.
Right.
And while specific theories might not always hold up under scientific scrutiny,
Right.
the overarching themes, things like the power of unconscious processes, the impact of early childhood experiences, the role of defense mechanisms, and the complexities of relationships, all of these continue to inform our understanding of who we are.
It's like we're all walking around with these invisible backpacks filled with our past experiences. And those experiences are constantly shapes how we interact with the world.
That's a great analogy.
Yeah.
And psychoanalysis provides us with a framework for unpacking those backpacks, exploring their contents and understanding how those experiences shape our thoughts, feelings, and behaviors.
It's a journey of self-discovery, really.
Absolutely. And while it can be daunting to delve into those hidden depths, it can also be incredibly liberating.
Like we're reclaiming our power by understanding the forces that have been shaping us all along.
Exactly. And that's a key aspect of personal growth and transformation.
Yeah, it really is amazing to think about how much is happening under the surface.
Yeah.
All those unconscious drives and desires that are pulling our strings.
It is. And psychoanalysis really gives us the tools to understand those hidden forces and maybe get a little bit more control over our lives.
It's like we've been driving a car without knowing how the engine works, and now we're finally popping the hood and taking a look inside.
I like that analogy. And while we might not always like what we see under the hood, that knowledge can be empowering.
So where do we go from here? How do we take all this information about Neo-Freudian theories and actually apply it to our lives? What do we do with it?
Well, I think one of the most important things is to just become more aware. Aware of those recurring patterns in our lives.
Okay.
Those relationship dynamics that keep repeating, the emotional triggers that send us into a tailspin.
It's like becoming an archaeologist of our own psyches, like digging up those buried artifacts of experience and trying to make sense of them.
Exactly. And by understanding those patterns, we can start to make different choices, break free from those self-defeating behaviors and create healthier, more fulfilling relationships.
It's like we're rewriting the script of our lives.
I like that. Yeah.
Okay, so besides therapy, are there other ways we can apply these ideas? What about things like, creativity, work, just navigating those everyday challenges of life?
Well, understanding those core motivations that we talked about, like the striving for superiority or the need for connection, that can help us make more conscious choices in all areas of our lives. For example, if you realize you have a strong need for achievement, you can channel that energy into productive pursuits, things that really bring you a sense of fulfillment.
So it's not about denying those drives or trying to suppress them.
Right.
It's more about understanding them and directing them in a way that serves us.
Exactly. It's about harnessing that energy and using it to create the life you want.
That makes a lot of sense. And what about creativity? I know Jung talked a lot about the role of the unconscious in the creative process.
Yeah.
What did he say about that?
He did. Jung believed that our dreams, our fantasies, even those seemingly random flashes of insight, they're all expressions of the unconscious mind trying to communicate with us.
It's like our unconscious is this wellspring of creativity that we just need to tap into.
Right. And he believed that if we pay attention to those symbols and archetypes that emerge in our dreams and creative expressions, it can give us some really valuable insights into our deepest selves.
So keeping a dream journal and really kind of exploring those symbolic images could be helpful.
Absolutely. And don't be afraid to let your imagination run wild. Sometimes the most profound insights come from those seemingly nonsensical or absurd ideas that just bubble up from the unconscious.
It's like giving ourselves permission to play, to explore, to experiment without judgment or censorship.
Exactly. And that's where a lot of creative breakthroughs happen.
This has been such an eye-opening conversation. I feel like I have a whole new vocabulary for understanding myself and the people in my life.
Well, I'm glad to hear that. And remember, it's a journey of self-discovery. There's always more to learn and explore.
Well, on that note, I think it's time to wrap up our deep dive into the world of Neo-Freudian thought. Thanks for joining me on this fascinating exploration. And to you, dear listener, I hope this has sparked your curiosity, given you some new tools to understand the complexities of the human psyche. Keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep diving deep.